Hey everyone, Temporal here, and today I'm going to talk about the quad DPS comp, the one that we've seen come out of Stormquake, some Chinese contenders. It's really a snowball comp, and you're going to want to use it on offense if you do use it. Obviously, it is pretty map dependent on having high ground to play with, different angles that your DPS can take with some amount of safety, etc. But to start off, what the comp looks like is you're going to run Hammond or Orisa, 4 range DPS that have some sort of mobility preferably, and then Mercy or Lucio. Orisa is generally better once you've gotten the cart going, once you're trying to continue that snowball, or if there's relevant high ground that she can play off of. Once you've gotten that snowball going, Orisa pushes the cart while your team pushes very far ahead, makes every entry of the approach hellish for the Goats team. Hammond, on the other hand, is the choice when there isn't a safe, relevant spot to put your Orisa. If you're on offense, he's probably the one that you're going to take right out the gate, but not necessarily. Both of these tanks, however, need to function with very little to no team support. Hammond does this by roaming for health packs with his hypermobility between cycles of disrupting the Goats comp, and Orisa does this by keeping 100% shield uptime. If her shield is down, she needs to be behind cover because no one should have to come back to heal her. If she's getting pushed, she should leave ahead of time, long before she gets pushed. For support, you're going to want to bring Mercy to start, and your primary job is to pocket Pharah. You won't pocket her as hard as you would in a pharmacy comp because a real pharmacy comp is going to have a second support of some sort, but you are going to pay way more attention to her than anyone else. The rest of the team can't be playing in a way where they're counting on you to heal them. Really, the only time you're going to consistently break off to heal someone as Mercy in this comp is you might leave your Pharah because a Winston or a Diva is jumping on a DPS. Breaking off to heal them up, help them with that, handling that dive, that can be fine. For DPS, you need to stack as much range damage as you possibly can while still keeping relevant self-sufficient abilities, a little bit of mobility, stuff that's hard for Goats to pin down so that they can't make you a chink in the armor and go ahead and just dive onto you with their Goats comp and kill you. Widow, Soldier, and Pharah are all excellent for this. Hanzo, Ashe, and Junkrat are also perfectly acceptable. So probably take the first three, one of the last three, you're going to be good to go there, at least to start. DPS then need to take different angles from each other, recognizing that they can't expect to get that support. Creating as much crossfire as possible without putting yourself in a huge amount of risk is what you need to be doing. You are specifically hunting for kills here. You're not looking to exhaust the enemy team. You're not looking to wear down their Rhine shield, make them run out of Diva defense matrix. Of course, you're going to shoot at those things, demand those things get wasted if that's all that's available to your angle. But if you've set up properly, someone is always doing damage to someone. You know, the Rhine Shield turns to block out the Soldier, the Pharah's got the hits going in. The Diva blocks out the Hanzo. Great, now we've got Junkrat slipping some nades by. Doesn't matter. You're setting up in that way so that you've got someone always doing damage, and you should pretty quickly be able to find kills on this comp. If anyone does get pushed, it's going to either be by the entire Goats comp, or it's going to be by just a Diva, or in the case of floats, maybe a Winston. And the person being pushed is going to want to use their mobility to leave before that threat arrives. The entire team at this point is going to be able to immediately shred that extending hero, or now get shots in behind the comp if the whole comp is pushing in with their insane levels of poke. Seriously, an ape, a mech, those should get blown out of the sky almost before they land on the DPS that they were jumping out to try to get on there. Once you win that first fight, it's all about pushing ahead to maintain the snowball. You don't have a real tank presence to take contested space, so instead you're going to take a ton of space while it's free since the enemy team is respawning from that first wipe. You then use your DPS to enforce that space. As long as you keep the snowball going, you keep taking space far ahead of the payload after each one fight, so the enemy team has to push into that contested space, has to push through your fire. Then you're going to go ahead and do okay, because DPS can do an okay job of enforcing space. They're just not so good at taking contested space in the first place. but the goats team is going to want to push through that space as long as you've pushed far ahead, because the payload's just moving. Since you've pushed so far ahead of your payload, your Orissa's back on the payload just pushing it. The goats team doesn't want that to happen. They're going to try to push in and go stop that point. The enemy is very likely to swap off of goats into some sort of dive comp, because that is the appropriate counter for quad DPS. If they don't, they're probably at least going to add a sniper, someone who has decent one-shot capability on all those squishy heroes that you're running. Doesn't matter. What you're going to do to adapt to this, oh, you're running snipers, you're running dive comps, maybe you're running dive comp with a Widow, is start moving some of your ranged DPS over to flankers. 2 flankers is fine, unless your Widow isn't able to get anything done, in which case you can have her swap and move over to a 3rd flanker. But this doesn't need to all happen at once. This swap doesn't have to be, oh, they swapped onto dive, let's all immediately swap. Don't need to look for that. It's more important that you maintain that snowball and you maintain that space control very far in front of the payload that you're trying to snowball. But make those swaps as you can. Swap in a flanker at a time. Mercy wants to work her way over to Lucio as soon as you've either dropped the Pharah or once you've got more than one flanker there. Your flankers are now playing a game of area denial. Remember, your only tank is back on the payload. Your flankers are really looking to preempt the Widow from setting up. They want to deny her the space that she'd like to have. They don't need to go in deep and kill the Widow. They can just cut her off, not let her take the spots that she wants. And if she can't take the spots that she wants, your own Widow is pretty much going to be able to keep the snowball going on her own. If, on the other hand, the enemy team is going super flanker heavy, super dive tank heavy, they're trying to force their way back to the Widow. Remember, you took lots of space in front of the cart, so they have to go through a lot of open space to get your Widow. And you can also use your DPS to shoo away those tanks. So if they go ahead and are running a Widow at you, your flankers want to be playing in a way where they're denying her space. They're not letting her get set up. They're shooing her out of position by occupying those spaces or sweeping those spaces that she'd like to be in. That allows your Widow to carry. If instead the other team isn't going the sniper route, they're going like a more traditional dive, a full dive, or maybe a dive with like a McCree or a soldier or something like that, that's fine. Your Widow's pretty much going to be able to carry against that, again, as long as your heavy DPS presence is using that space and forcing that space, not letting them get to her. If you do get wiped while playing this comp, it's time to swap. Unless you have a fantastic ult bank, do remember I'm describing this as a snowball comp, and once your snowball stopped, it's over. You're not going to be able to take back the contested space you need to get your Widow or any sort of sniper back into a place to do work without a real tank presence. Again, tanks are good at taking contested space and then enforcing that contested space. DPS do better at enforcing the space, but are not so good at pushing into it, so they won't be able to set up the Widow. So you're going to make a swap. And in this meta, that means you're going to swap into goats yourself. On the plus side, you're swapping into goats before your opponent because they swapped off of goats. So yay, ult economy advantage. On the negative side, no, you don't really get an ult economy advantage because you had to make more swaps to get to goats than they're going to have to make to get back to goats. You shouldn't expect to consistently come out ahead in the ult economy there, but sometimes you will. So the last piece I want to touch on is why not just go dive as soon as the opponent starts swapping off of goats? You know, you could go for that mirror dive matchup, right? Well, doesn't really work out that way. We're making swaps when the opponent starts to swap off of goats, and we're making swaps onto flankers like we talked about here. So we're losing some range DPS for flankers. That makes it a little bit better against fighting dive, while making it not very much worse at all at playing against ghosts. Yes, quad range DPS is better for taking down goats than 2 range DPS with 2 flankers. But you know, if you're running Widow, Pharmacy, Tracer, Sombra at a goats comp, they're still not going to be very happy. That Tracer and Sombra are going to be very self-sustainable. That Sombra's going to have potentially EMPs there. They can take 4 different angles quite easily with those DPS. So you're still pretty darn good against goats. You're just not quite as good as that 4 range DPS setup. And you're better, at least as long as you're controlling the snowballed space, against a dive comp than you would be if you still had the 4 range DPS. So that's why that swap looks awkward like that, and why you're seeing teams like Stormquake who are doing this going from poke DPS to flankers rather than just having their third and fourth DPS swap back to second tank, second support, and looking for the mirror dive. You can swap back to dive and look for the mirror dive there, but at that point, nothing stops your opponents from just going back to goats themselves. And then you could have to go back to quad DPS yourself. That's something you could do. If you're really trying to get value out of this, you're really trying to make your snowball work, this works out a little bit better. Anyway, that's what I've got today. If you guys have any questions or would like to suggest something for me to cover in the future, please let me know. Thanks, guys. Tim Portal out.